In Farmer Boy, Alice Wilder is alive in every room. She is working, learning, laughing with the others, and moving through Almanzo's childhood so naturally that a reader may never think to ask where her life went afterward. But the adult Alice died in Florida at 38, far from the New York farm that made her familiar. And Alice was not the only Wilder sister whose life changed beyond the edge of the book. Eliza Jane became a teacher, a homesteader, a government worker, a wife, a mother, a widow, and a woman who kept beginning again. Laura Ann, the oldest sister, disappeared from the novel altogether, then reappeared in church records, household records, children's lives, and a final family movement toward Louisiana. Tonight, we're going past the last page of Farmer Boy, not to accuse Laura Ingalls Wilder of hiding anything, because a childhood novel is not a promise to preserve every adult life. We're going because three girls once belonged to the same household, and adulthood carried them into three very different kinds of distance. Before we follow them, if these quiet histories help you settle in at night, subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Our 3 little books are waiting at prairiesecrets.com. If you're watching on a television, scan the QR code on your screen. On your phone, the links are waiting in the description and the pinned comments. Thank you for spending this time with me, and if you drift off somewhere along the way, good, I'll keep watch. The first thing to understand is that Farmer Boy is not a camera left running in the Wilder farmhouse. It is a shaped story, published in 1933, about a boyhood remembered across decades. It gives us work, food, weather, school, animals, family discipline, and the enormous satisfaction of doing a hard job well. It also arranges those things into a year that feels complete. Real households are rarely so tidy. Children are born years apart. Older children begin adult lives while younger ones still think the family table is the fixed centre of the world. Parents make moves in stages. One child stays behind to work. Another goes ahead. A married daughter belongs to the household and does not belong to it in quite the same way anymore. The Wilder family had 3 daughters before Almanzo was born. Laura Ann came first, in 1844. Eliza Jane followed in 1850. Alice Maria was born in 1853. Then came Almanzo in 1857. Their brother Royal was older than Eliza and Alice, and the youngest child, Prairie, arrived much later, after the childhood season associated with Farmer Boy. That order matters. By the middle of the 1860s, Laura Ann was no longer a little girl standing beside Almanzo. She was already a young woman. Eliza Jane was old enough to be moving toward work and responsibility outside the farm. Alice, closer to Almanzo in age, remained part of the everyday sibling world the novel could use most easily. This helps explain one of the book's quietest choices. Laura Ann does not appear in Farmer Boy at all. Later family tradition has offered more than one reason. She was older and already moving toward a separate life. Another Laura in the Wilder family might also have confused young readers, especially when the author herself was named Laura Wilder by marriage. We cannot know how much each reason mattered inside the writing process. What we can say is simpler. The real Laura Ann existed. Her absence from the novel is not evidence that she was unimportant. It is evidence that a novel has a frame, and people can stand just outside it. Alice stands well inside that frame. She works with her sisters. She goes to school. She takes part in the household's endless exchange of labour, correction, competition, appetite, and reward. The literary Alice is capable enough to belong in the family's working rhythm, but still young enough to share Almanzo's world. Eliza Jane is there too, though readers often remember her more sharply from another book. In Little Town on the Prairie, she appears as Laura Ingalls' difficult teacher in Dakota Territory. That later portrayal can flatten her into a type, the stern sister, the schoolteacher no one liked, the woman whose name arrives already carrying someone else's irritation. The surviving record gives her more weight than that. Eliza Jane's own Homestead papers preserve a woman working in weather severe enough to freeze the mercury, trying to keep a claim alive, teaching for wages, caring for property, and explaining herself to federal officials who had the power to decide whether the land would remain hers. Alice's adult trail is thinner. That is part of what makes her story so tempting and so dangerous. A thin record invites a writer to fill the room. It encourages soft inventions. Perhaps she felt this. Perhaps her marriage was like that. Perhaps she feared the move south. Perhaps her brother grieved in some particular private way. But perhaps is not evidence, so we are going to leave the private rooms closed when the documents leave them closed. Alice does not need an invented deathbed to matter. Laura Ann does not need a manufactured family conflict to become visible. Eliza Jane does not need to be turned into either a heroine or a villain. They only need to be followed carefully. The path begins near Burke in Franklin County, New York, in a landscape of fields, woods, stone walls, cold winters, and a farm substantial enough to make Almanzo's childhood seem almost luxurious beside the poorer frontier homes in the other Little House books. The family's work was constant, but so was its abundance. Milk, butter, apples, grain, animals, cloth, schoolbooks, tools and meals all came from a system that required everyone to do a part. For a child, that system could feel permanent. The barn would always be there. The house would always smell of work and food. Father and mother would always know what came next. Older sisters might tease, instruct, compete, or help, but they would remain sisters inside the same rooms. For the daughters, the farm was never going to remain the whole world. Later accounts place Eliza Jane at Franklin Academy in Malone. That claim is strong enough to take seriously, though not every exact school detail has been recovered. The academy mattered because education gave a young woman one of the few respectable routes to paid independence. Teaching could carry her beyond the farm without requiring marriage first. Eliza was certified as a teacher while still young. Surviving accounts place her first teaching work around the age of 19. That does not mean the work was gentle or secure. A school term could be temporary. A teacher might board with local families. Her authority depended on community support, student obedience, and the board's willingness to renew her. Still, wages were wages. A classroom was a place where Eliza Jane's knowledge had a public use. It was also a place where her directness, pride, and determination could be read very differently, depending on who was doing the remembering. Alice may also have attended Franklin Academy. The evidence is not strong enough to say she graduated in a particular year. That difference matters. Attendance and graduation are not the same claim, and a polished documentary should not turn a likely school connection into a diploma simply because the diploma would make a cleaner sentence. The adult sisters begin to emerge through distinctions like that. Eliza Jane's education leads into work we can document. Alice's education remains a probable part of the story, but not a finished credential. Laura Ann's early adult life is quieter still, and by the time the family's Western movement began, she was already becoming a bridge between the old household and the next place. The Wilders did not simply close one New York door, load every person into a wagon, and arrive together in Minnesota. The move unfolded in stages. Later local histories disagree about exactly which older children remained in New York during the first part of the transition. That disagreement is useful because it reminds us that a family move can be a long process rather than a single day. James and Angeline Wilder had family connections in Spring Valley, Minnesota. Land was acquired there before the final New York property was completely left behind. Parents and younger children could go west while older children stayed to work, teach, manage property or finish obligations. Then the household gathered again in a different arrangement. Spring Valley's local historical society places Laura Ann there before the entire family settle permanently. It also remembers Eliza Jane as a teacher. By 1875, the Wilders had sold the New York farm and made Minnesota their main home. That sentence sounds simple. It is not. The farm that readers know as Almanzo's childhood world became someone else's property. The family name continued, but the physical centre changed. The older daughters no longer had a childhood home to return to in the same way. New York became origin. Minnesota became the place where marriages, jobs, land decisions, and separations would turn siblings into separate households. Laura Ann was already ahead of that change. She had been born 13 years before Almanzo. By the time the final move gathered the Wilders in Spring Valley, she was about 30. Local church history records that marriage rites were performed for her there. Her husband was Harrison Howard, and family histories place their marriage in the middle of the 1870s. The exact details of the ceremony do not survive in the records available to us. We do not need lace, weather, vows, or a crowd invented around them. The important fact is the condition change. Laura Ann was no longer simply James and Angeline's oldest daughter. She was part of a Howard household. Marriage changed a woman's legal and practical identity. Her name changed in public records. Her work remained large, but much of it became harder to trace because household labour rarely left a ledger. Children made her visible again through census lines, marriages, and later descendants. Yet even there, names and dates can conflict across family trees. What survives most clearly is not a complete portrait. It is the outline of responsibility. Laura Ann became a wife and mother. Her life remained tied to Spring Valley and later to the southern migration that drew several Wilders toward Louisiana. Eliza Jane, meanwhile, was still moving through work. Alice was moving toward marriage. And Almanzo, the boy at the centre of the novel, was reaching the age when land in Dakota Territory began to look like a future. 3 sisters had grown from the same farm. Now every adult decision would widen the distance between them. By the late 1870s, Spring Valley had become less a destination than a launching place. Laura Ann had her own household. Alice was entering one. Eliza Jane was about to stake a claim under her own name. The old family structure had not vanished, but it no longer held everyone in the same orbit. Alice married Albert A. Baldwin in Fillmore County. A compiled county index confirms the pairing of their names. The exact year remains less cooperative. Later sources divide between 1878 and 1879, and the original dated marriage record was not opened during the research for this script. That is the sort of disagreement that can seem small until a writer tries to turn it into a scene. An exact wedding date becomes a season becomes weather becomes a dress, a road, a gathering, and suddenly a single unresolved number has produced a room full of invented furniture. So we will keep the room bare. Alice Wilder married Albert Baldwin in Fillmore County near the end of the 1870s. She crossed into a new household, and the records begin calling her Alice Baldwin. At almost the same moment, Eliza Jane made a choice that pointed in the opposite direction. She did not begin with marriage. She went west with her brothers Royal and Almanzo to Dakota Territory. In April of 1879, Eliza Jane moved into a landscape where the future was being measured in sections, townships, railroad lines, and claims. She filed for a homestead in August. The legal description placed her near Smet, in the same broad community where Almanzo and Royal were trying to establish themselves. A homestead claim sounds generous when reduced to one sentence. The government offered land to people willing to improve and occupy it. But the promise came with conditions. A claimant had to build, cultivate, reside, prove and satisfy officials that the land had been treated as a real home rather than a paper opportunity. For a single woman, the claim offered something unusual. Land could belong to her in her own name. That did not make the work smaller. It made the responsibility unmistakably hers. Eliza Jane built a life that moved between the claim and the classroom. Teaching provided income. The land demanded labour. The distances between town, school, family and claim did not care that one person was trying to hold all of them together. The first years in Dakota Territory were years of unstable beginnings. Smet itself was forming around the railroad. Buildings rose quickly. People arrived with lumber, goods, animals, household equipment, and a willingness to call a place a town before it had fully become one. Eliza's claim sat in the larger geometry of settlement. A square of land on a map could look orderly. On the ground it meant wind, grass, mud, snow, heat, fuel, water, fencing, cultivation, and the constant question of where a person would sleep when the weather turned. Then the winter of 1880 to 1881 arrived. The long winter is familiar because Laura Ingalls Wilder made it one of the great survival stories in the Little House books. Trains stopped, supplies failed, wheat was ground in a coffee mill, the town waited under one storm after another. Eliza Jane's own homestead file preserves another angle. She later told federal officials that an October blizzard reduced visibility until almost nothing could be seen. The railroad was blocked. Flour and coal disappeared from stores. Her mother took her back to Minnesota for the winter, and Eliza left belongings behind because she expected the absence to be brief. It was not brief. Storm followed storm. The trains did not return on the schedule anyone wanted. Eliza's property remained in Dakota while she remained away from it. That distance mattered because a homestead claim depended on residence, and residence could be questioned by officials who saw dates more clearly than necessity. A woman could leave because winter made survival dangerous, and later be asked whether leaving proved the claim had never truly been home. Eliza Jane's letters to the land authorities were therefore more than memories. They were arguments. She had to explain absences, improvements, labour, weather, and intention. The letters are among the most valuable documents in the Wilder family record because they preserve her trying to make the government understand the difference between abandonment and endurance. She described intense cold. On her birthday in January of 1884, she worked outdoors for hours while wind and sleet struck hard enough to leave the day fixed in memory. She admitted that she'd felt blue and discouraged. That small admission carries more weight than pages of invented emotion. It does not tell us everything she felt. It gives us one honest edge of it. Cold, work, isolation, and a birthday spent proving that the claim would not defeat her. She also wrote about improvements to the house and the value she had added. The money matters. $100 spent on a claim house was not decoration. It represented wages, materials, transport, tools, and a decision to make the place more livable because she intended the place to last. The homestead file also preserves physical danger. In August of 1882, a severe storm struck Smet. Wind, rain, and hail damaged buildings and crops. Eliza reported that the hail blackened her hand and arm. A church was crushed. Other structures were shifted from their foundations. This is not the version of Eliza Jane most readers meet first. The literary teacher in a little town on the prairie is remembered through Laura's irritation. She is formal. She struggles to control the room. Students resist her. The remembered teacher becomes almost painfully easy to judge because the story belongs to one of the pupils. The woman in the federal file is harder to reduce. She can be proud and difficult. She can also be competent, exhausted, physically brave, worried about money, and unwilling to surrender land she'd improved with her own labour. Those things can all be true at once. Eliza Jane taught in Smet in the early 1880s. A classroom placed her in authority over young people who already knew one another, already had loyalties, and did not necessarily accept the teacher's manner. Her work required control, but too much control could make the room turn against her. Too little could make the school board decide she had failed. Later memory preserved the friction. The Homestead papers preserved the burden outside the classroom. Together they make a fuller woman than either source alone. The school term also placed Eliza near Laura Ingalls. This is where the two Laura names begin to complicate the family story. Laura Ingalls was a teenager. Laura Ann Wilder was Almanzo's oldest sister and already a married woman. Eliza Jane was both Almanzo's sister and Laura Ingalls' teacher. Years later, Laura Ingalls would marry Almanzo and become Laura Ingalls Wilder. Decades after that, she would publish a childhood book about the Wilder household that omitted Laura Ann, included Alice, and portrayed Eliza Jane first as a sister in New York and later as a teacher in Dakota. The archive does not organise itself for a viewer. It simply keeps placing the same names in different roles until we slow down enough to separate them. Eliza Jane continued working toward final ownership of her claim. The federal process was not automatic. Questions arose about her residence. She answered them in writing. The fact that those letters survive means we can hear her defending the practical truth of her life. She had worked. She had improved the house. She had endured weather that would have driven many people away. When she left, she believed the absence temporary. When she returned, she resumed the burden. The claim eventually became hers. That sentence is one of the largest condition changes in this family story. The girl from the New York farm became a woman with federal land under her own name. She did it before marrying. She did it in a territory where survival required neighbours and kin, but legal proof still narrowed down to one claimant. Ownership did not settle her forever. The land gave her a result, not a final home. Later in the 1880s, Eliza Jane moved east to Washington. Family research places her in government work connected with the Department of the Interior. The details of every position remain incomplete, so it is safer to say that she entered the world later remembered by the phrase government girl. The move itself reveals a pattern. Eliza Jane had already crossed from farm to classroom, from Minnesota to Dakota, from teacher to claimant. Washington carried her into offices, records, salaries, and federal administration. The woman who had written to land officials now worked inside the broader government world that had judged her claim. It would be easy to make that sound triumphant. Life rarely arranges itself so neatly. Government work could mean independence, but it could also mean limited pay, repetitive duties, and the knowledge that a woman's professional place remained narrower than a man's. Still, the distance from the family farm was real. Eliza Jane had built a life that did not depend on remaining in her parents' household or marrying young. While she moved through Dakota and Washington, Alice's life became more domestic and less visible. She and Albert Baldwin established themselves in the Marshall and Lyon County area of Minnesota. Later accounts describe a farm there, though the exact acreage and legal ownership should not be stated without the deed and tax records. A farm near Marshall was not an empty western beginning. Other Wilder family members had connections in the broader region. Almanzo and Royal were farther west in Dakota Territory. Angeline held family and land ties. Siblings who no longer shared a roof could still live within a network of travel, news, visits, labour and obligation. Alice and Albert had a daughter, Myrtle, around 1880. A son, Leland Edward, followed in the middle of the decade. The exact birth year for Leland varies in later sources, so the safest picture is a household with 2 young children by the time the family's Minnesota years ended. Children create records because households are counted. They also create the kind of daily life that records usually ignore. Feeding, washing, mending, illness, sleep, discipline, school, weather, and the 1,000 small exchanges between a mother and child leave almost no paper unless something goes wrong. Alice's adult life is full of that absence. We know enough to see the household. We do not know enough to walk through an ordinary day inside it. Laura Ann's household was growing too. Later family histories named several Howard children. The exact list shifts across secondary sources, but the broad fact is secure. Laura Ann became the mother of a family whose later marriages would connect Spring Valley to Louisiana. The 3 sisters now occupied 3 different positions. Laura Ann was the eldest married daughter, living through the long middle of household responsibility. Alice was a younger wife and mother on a Minnesota farm, close enough to the Wilder network to remain connected, but increasingly carried by her own family's decisions. Eliza Jane was the unmarried teacher and landowner, moving between claim, school, government, and the possibility of a life built outside the usual sequence. The farmhouse in New York had taught all 3 of them to work. Adulthood decided what kinds of work would leave a record. By the middle of the 1880s, the Baldwin household was preparing to move again. Later accounts say Albert's health was failing, and that a warmer climate seemed worth trying. No medical record currently available names his condition. That uncertainty matters because the 19th century was full of climate cures, vague diagnoses, and journeys made on advice that sounded sensible because there were few better options. A warmer place could promise relief without promising recovery. Florida was becoming one of those places. Promoters described mild winters, citrus, open land, and opportunity. Families carried illness south because cold itself had become an enemy in their minds, or because a doctor, relative, advertisement, or neighbour had suggested that heat and air might do what medicine had not. For Alice and Albert, the move meant leaving the Minnesota farm period behind. The exact deed that would tell us when land was sold and for how much was not opened. The human fact remains. A couple with 2 children left the region where the Wilder family had gathered and travelled toward the Atlantic coast of Florida. They settled in or near Georgiana on Merritt Island in Brevard County. Georgiana was small enough that a family's arrival changed the community by one household. A county historical guide places only about 24 homesteaders, or roughly 25 families there near the end of the 1880s. The settlement lay in a long, narrow island landscape between waterways, with land used for homes, gardens, citrus, pineapples, and the practical routes that connected residents by boat and rough road. The geography was beautiful in the way difficult places often are. Water was everywhere, but usable transport depended on weather, boats, docks, and distance. The soil and climate could grow fruit that Minnesota never could. The same climate brought insects, dampness, heat, storms, and isolation from the family network Alice had known. Later family and local histories say Albert worked in orange groves. No open deed or employment record proves that he owned or managed a particular grove. The safer picture is a man associated with citrus labour in a community shaped by citrus. There is also a later reconstruction that places a 35-acre purchase in Albert's name in 1888. The precise claim is useful as a research lead, but without the underlying record it should remain a lead. We do not need to turn an unopened parcel into a plantation, or build a house on it with words. What we can see is enough. The Baldwins had moved into a settlement where land, trees and health were tied together. The climate meant to help Albert became the setting of Alice's final years. Later family research describes Alice as becoming ill with consumption. In 19th century language, consumption often referred to a wasting disease associated with tuberculosis, but the words are not interchangeable without a medical record. We cannot modernize the diagnosis simply because the older term feels familiar. So the honest statement is this. A later source says Alice suffered from consumption. No opened civil or medical record confirms the diagnosis. The uncertainty does not reduce the fact that her health declined. Alice was still in her 30s. Myrtle was about 12 when her mother died. Leland was younger. The household had moved south under a health story attached to Albert, and then Alice became the one whose life ended there. In the winter of 1891 to 1892, Angeline Wilder and her youngest son Prairie were in Florida. A Spring Valley newspaper later noted their return from a winter visit. That places Alice's mother and brother somewhere in the state around the period of her death. It does not place them at her bedside. That distinction may feel painfully cautious, but it protects the people in the story. It would be easy to write a final gathering, a mother crossing a room, a brother waiting outside, children being led away. The facts do not give us that scene. The facts give us presence in Florida, not a deathbed. Alice Maria Wilder Baldwin died in Georgiana on February 22, 1892. The commonly accepted birth and death dates make her 38. She was buried in the local burial ground associated with Georgiana, also known as Crooked Mile Cemetery. The two names have caused confusion in later retellings, but they refer to the same general burial place. The exact plot, funeral, inscription, and burial day details were not opened in a person-level register for this research. The trail from the New York farmhouse ended on Merritt Island. A grave can make a life seem smaller than it was because a marker compresses everything into a name and 2 years. Alice had crossed from Franklin County to Minnesota, from sister to wife, from wife to mother, from one farm region to another, and from a cold northern landscape to a subtropical island. The documents do not tell us whether she believed the move had been worth it. They do not tell us whether she missed New York, whether she wanted to return to Minnesota, or how she understood the illness later called consumption. They tell us that she went. They tell us that she stayed long enough for Georgiana to become the place attached to her death. They tell us that 2 children continued without her. After February, the record shifts to the household that remained. Albert survived. That fact alone warns us not to invent an immediate guardianship crisis. Myrtle and Leland had lost their mother, but their father was still alive. No court file yet recovered shows a legal transfer of custody. No contemporary newspaper account yet recovered describes the arrangements made in the first days after the burial. By 1900, later census-based accounts place Albert and Georgiana with a second wife named Ellen. Myrtle and Leland were still connected to the household. A younger daughter, Nina, also appears in the later family chain. The original census image was not opened during the Alice research, so the wording must remain bounded. It is still enough to resist a dramatic assumption. The children did not vanish from the record after their mother's death. At least one later household account places them with their father. Myrtle's life is easier to follow than Leland's. She married, remained in Florida, and had a large family. Later records carry her into the middle of the 20th century. The daughter born during Alice's Minnesota years became the branch through which Alice's descendants continued well beyond the small cemetery on Merritt Island. Leland's endpoint is less secure. Later family listings disagree, and the original civil record needed to confirm his final years was not opened. We can follow him only so far without turning repetition on genealogy pages into proof. Albert's own life ended in 1905. Later accounts say he drowned in the Banana River. The surviving outline does not give us a boat, weather, witnesses, rescue, or the sequence of the accident. The word drowned is not permission to create water around him. He was buried in the same general cemetery associated with Alice. Alice's story therefore closes twice, first with her death at 38, then with Albert's death 13 years later, leaving the children to carry the Baldwin household forward without either parent. This is the strongest emotional movement in the documentary, and it is also the easiest place to overreach. We do not know Almanzo's private response. We do not know whether Laura Ingalls Wilder ever heard a detailed account. We do not know what letters passed among siblings, or whether any survive in an unopened folder. The adult Alice remains close enough to see and too far away to hear. While Alice's life narrowed toward Georgiana, Laura Ann remained in the long, quieter middle of family life. She had been the oldest child in the Wilder household, old enough to stand partly outside Almanzo's remembered boyhood. In Minnesota, she became Laura Howard. Her children made Spring Valley a place of continuity, rather than merely a stop between New York and somewhere farther west. Local history records that Laura Ann had already been living in the Spring Valley area before the whole Wilder family completed its move. That made her more than a daughter who followed. She helped create the destination the rest of the family joined. Later family accounts place her marriage to Harrison Howard in 1874. Spring Valley church records preserve the fact that marriage rites were performed for Laura Ann, though the full ceremony record has not been reproduced in the sources used here. Their household included children whose names appear unevenly across later compilations. Angeline, Harrison, Josephine and Waldo are among the names most consistently associated with the family. Exact dates should be handled carefully because derivative trees disagree. The safest human picture is a mother raising children while the Wilder family spread across Minnesota and Dakota Territory. Laura Ann's life also reveals how the word sister changes after marriage. She remained Alice's sister, Eliza Jane's sister, and Almanzo's sister. Yet travel, childbirth, work, property, and the needs of a husband's household could make sisterhood less visible in records. A census does not ask whether 2 sisters exchanged advice. A deed does not record who came to help after a birth. A church book may preserve a marriage, but not the ordinary years that followed. That silence is not evidence of distance in the heart. It is evidence of what institutions chose to write down. Laura Ann's daughter Angeline appears later in the family's southern network. She spent time with her Wilder grandparents in Spring Valley and eventually married into the Merritt family in Louisiana. That marriage helped link Laura Ann's children to Pearlie Wilder's future household, because Pearlie would marry another member of the Merritt family. Family movement rarely follows a straight westward line. By the end of the century, several Wilders were moving south. The person pulling hardest in that direction was Eliza Jane. Eliza Jane's move to Washington placed her inside a different kind of American expansion. On the prairie, the government existed as survey lines, land offices, requirements, and letters demanding proof. In Washington, government became desks, departments, supervisors, forms, salaries, and the daily machinery behind those distant decisions. Later, family research remembers her as a government girl connected with the Department of the Interior. The phrase can sound light, almost fashionable, but the work mattered. Federal offices employed women in growing numbers, usually in positions with limited authority and lower pay than men. A woman who entered that world could earn her own income while remaining subject to rules built around male careers. Eliza Jane had already learned how much could depend on wording in a federal file. She knew that a claim was not secure because a person had suffered for it. Suffering had to be translated into dates, improvements, residence, witnesses, and compliance. It is not difficult to imagine why an office might suit part of her mind. We do not need to invent that she loved it. We only need to notice the continuity. School records, homestead records, and government records all rewarded organization, persistence, and the ability to make a case. She also became interested in women's public rights. Later accounts connect her with the broader cause of women's equality. The exact organizations and meetings need more direct documentation, but the direction fits the life already visible. Eliza Jane had owned land, taught for wages, negotiated with federal officials, and supported herself outside marriage. She had personal reasons to understand how law shaped a woman's freedom. By the early 1890s, however, she was back in the family's Minnesota world. She returned to Spring Valley and married Thomas Jefferson Thayer in September of 1893. Thomas was older, a merchant, and had been married before. He brought children from earlier marriages into the new household. Eliza Jane entered marriage at 43, after more than 2 decades of work and independence. That timing matters. She was not a young woman moving directly from her father's house into a husband's. She had lived alone, worked, claimed land, defended it, crossed states, and built an identity under her own name. Marriage did not erase that history. It changed the legal and household frame around it. Thomas Thayer had business interests in Crowley, Louisiana, a town founded only a few years earlier along the railroad. Crowley was growing quickly because rice was becoming the great commercial promise of southwestern Louisiana. Land promoters, merchants, millers, farmers, clerks, labourers, and families arrived in a place that seemed to offer a new kind of agricultural future. The landscape could hardly have looked less like northern New York or Dakota Territory. Water management mattered more than snowdrifts. Rice fields, canals, mills, rail cars, heat, mud, and Gulf weather replaced the long, dry sightlines of the prairie. Crowley was new enough that property could feel like opportunity made visible. Blocks were surveyed, houses appeared, businesses opened, newspapers announced sales, meetings, arrivals, departures, marriages, illnesses, and the endless small claims of a town trying to prove it had become important. Eliza Jane and Thomas settled there. Their son was born in June of 1894 and was named Walcott Wilder Thayer, though the family called him Wilder. The name carried her family into the next generation. Wilder was no longer only the surname she had been born with. It became her son's everyday name. Thomas had children from earlier marriages, so Eliza Jane entered a blended household rather than a newly made family of 3. One daughter, Etta, remained part of the home. Later property research traces the Thayer houses and lots through Crowley's blocks, advertisements, and fire insurance maps. These details matter because they show Eliza Jane continuing to deal with property in practical ways. A house was not simply a sentimental setting. It could be an asset, a rental, a legal problem, a source of income, or a piece of an estate contested by different branches of a family. Thomas built a larger house for the marriage. Later photographs and maps have sometimes been confused, and researchers have had to separate one Thayer property from another. That confusion is a useful reminder. Even a house can acquire a literary identity that does not quite match the deed or map. For Eliza Jane, Crowley became the centre of a new plan. She encouraged members of the Wilder family to move south. By 1898, her parents, her brother Prairie, and her sister Laura Ann were among those drawn into the Louisiana branch of the family. The move was not merely emotional reunion. Southwestern Louisiana was being promoted as agricultural opportunity. Riceland offered the promise that had once belonged to Dakota wheat and Florida citrus. A family with farming experience could look at the new industry and see another chance to place work beside land and make the numbers come out right. The Wilders had spent decades moving toward promising climates and promising soil. New York to Minnesota, Minnesota to Dakota, Minnesota to Florida, Minnesota to Louisiana. Every move carried practical reasons. Every move also carried the old American hope that the next place would reward effort more fairly than the last. Eliza Jane's Louisiana plan gathered family members who had been living separate lives. James and Angeline came south in old age. Prairie would build a business and farming life there. Laura Ann came with her own children and history. Eliza Jane stood at the centre of the invitation. For a brief period, the family map narrowed again. Sisters who had been separated by households and states were living within the same southern region. Then 1899 arrived. James Mason Wilder died on the 1st of February. 8 days later, Thomas Thayer died. Eliza Jane lost her father and husband within little more than a week. Her son was 4 years old. There is no need to tell the listener how devastating that must have been. The dates already do the work. One funeral had barely entered family memory before another household lost its centre. The year did not stop there. Laura Ann died later in 1899. The exact date conflicts in later sources, so it is safer to say that she did not live to see the year end. The oldest Wilder sister, omitted from Farmer Boy because the childhood frame had no place for her, died in Louisiana while the family was still absorbing the deaths of James and Thomas. Alice had been gone 7 years. By the end of 1899, all 3 Wilder sisters had reached dramatically different conditions. Alice was buried in Florida, her children continuing under Albert's household. Laura Ann was dead in Louisiana, leaving grown or nearly grown children, and a family line tied to the Merritts and the Southern Wilder network. Eliza Jane was a widow with a young son, living in a new town where property and income had to be reorganised after her husband's estate began to break apart. The 3 daughters from the New York farm had not simply scattered. 2 were gone. 1 remained to rebuild. After Thomas's death, property he had owned was sold. Eliza Jane purchased lots of her own, including a house she could use as both home and income. She rented furnished rooms. That decision fits the woman who had defended a homestead. A house had to earn its keep. Widowhood could reduce a woman's security quickly, especially when an estate involved children from earlier marriages and property acquired before the final marriage. The exact legal settlement belongs to deeds and probate files, but the practical result is visible. Eliza Jane and young Wilder moved into a smaller property. She used rooms to produce money. The great house Thomas had built did not become a permanent monument to the marriage. It belonged to an estate, a changing town, and the next set of transactions. Crowley itself continued to grow around her. Rice mills expanded, railroad cars carried grain, merchants and farmers watched prices. New residents arrived because the town was being sold as a place where land and industry could cooperate. The promise was real enough to build a local economy. It was not equally kind to every family who entered it. Later accounts say that the Wilder family's Louisiana investments did not produce the secure prosperity they had hoped for. The exact phrase that the family fortune was lost is too broad unless every transaction is traced. What can be said is that the southern move did not create effortless wealth. James died soon after arriving. Laura Ann died the same year. Eliza Jane lost Thomas and had to turn property into survival. Pearlie remained and made a life in farming, trade, and public service. But the family's arrival did not resemble a triumphant final settlement. Eliza Jane kept moving forward because a child still depended on her. Wilder Thayer was the one person in her household whose future could not be postponed. He needed food, education, clothing, discipline, and a mother able to convert whatever remained into a stable life. The woman once remembered as a difficult teacher now had to teach through daily example. Records show property, rentals, addresses, and later family movements. They do not show the private conversation between mother and son. That silence is merciful. It leaves room for fact without pretending intimacy. In the years after Thomas's death, Eliza Jane remained connected to Almanzo and Laura Ingalls Wilder in Missouri. In 1903, after visiting them at Rocky Ridge, she helped arrange for their daughter Rose to come to Crowley and finish high school. This became one of the most consequential family connections in the entire story. Rose Wilder was 16. She had grown up through her parents' poverty, their Missouri farm, and a household that valued education but could not offer college. Crowley gave her a larger school and a different social world. Living with Aunt Eliza Jane placed her inside the home of a woman who had taught, homesteaded, worked for the government, managed property, married late, become widowed, and kept supporting herself. Rose graduated in 1904. We should be careful not to turn Eliza Jane into the single explanation for Rose's later independence. Rose's mind, ambitions, parents, reading, friendships, and opportunities all mattered. Yet the year in Crowley placed her near an aunt whose adult life offered a model unlike the quiet, domestic ideal often associated with the little house world. Eliza Jane's home also exposed Rose to politics. A newspaper notice from late 1903 listed Eliza Jane's address as the meeting place for a local socialist group. That does not tell us every belief she held, but it proves that the house was used for public political discussion. The detail is almost startling after the schoolroom caricature. The woman remembered for moral instruction and rigid order was opening her home to political meetings in a growing Louisiana town. A furnished-room house could therefore serve several purposes at once: income, shelter, education, family connection, political gathering. The building itself was eventually lost or transformed as Crowley became more commercial. The lot outlived the domestic arrangement. Maps changed. Industry moved closer. A house that had carried Eliza Jane, Wilder, Rose, boarders, and meetings disappeared from the visible town. The records keep the address. In July of 1904, Eliza Jane married again. Her second husband was Maxwell Gordon, an aspiring writer and poet. Later accounts describe the marriage as unhappy. The couple spent time in Brownsville, Texas, before the household broke apart. Gordon left, and Eliza Jane eventually divorced him. The record is enough to establish the failure of the marriage. It is not enough to assign every cause, repeat every accusation, or turn disappointment into a dramatic confrontation. A marriage can end without the archive preserving the argument that ended it. For Eliza Jane, the separation meant another name had entered the record and another household had failed to become permanent. She had been Eliza Wilder, Eliza Thayer, and Mrs. Maxwell Gordon. Through all of those changes, the person carrying the work remained the same woman. She continued supporting herself through practical means. Later in life, she sold household products and useful goods from door to door. The work was not grand, but it was direct. A person carried something another household might need and tried to turn the sale into enough income for the next day. There is gentle irony in that image. The daughter of a prosperous New York farm, the teacher, the homesteader, the government worker, and the owner of Crowley property spent part of her later life walking from house to house with goods to sell. But the irony should not be mistaken for humiliation. Work had always changed form around her. Teaching was work. Claim improvement was work. Office employment was work. Renting rooms was work. Selling useful things was work. Eliza Jane lived long enough to see the world around her alter beyond anything the children in Farmer Boy could have imagined. Railroads thickened across the country. Telephones entered homes and businesses. Automobiles appeared on roads that had once carried wagons. Women won the constitutional right to vote in 1920. For a woman who had owned land and argued with federal officials decades earlier, that change arrived late. Her son Wilder grew into adulthood and married Frances Cockrell in 1918. Eliza Jane later moved to Lafayette to be near the younger household. The child born after her late first marriage became the centre of her final family life. She suffered illness and strokes in her last years. Eliza Jane died on June 1st, 1930 in Louisiana. She was 80. 3 years later, Farmer Boy was published. That timing changes the way we hear her literary afterlife. Eliza Jane never lived to see herself become the older sister in one of the most beloved children's books in America. She never saw the schoolteacher version of herself appear in the published Little Town on the Prairie, which came even later. She could not answer the portrait. She could not say which parts felt fair, which parts felt shaped, or whether she would have laughed at the whole business. The records she left are therefore especially important. A fictional character cannot correct a reader. A Homestead letter can. It does not turn Eliza Jane into a saint. It gives her weather, money, work, property, fatigue, and a voice directed toward a practical purpose. She was trying to keep land. The woman on the page can be irritating. The woman in the file can be impressive. The same person may have been both. Laura Ann's record never becomes as rich as Eliza Jane's. That difference is not a measure of whose life mattered more. It reflects the kinds of institutions each woman encountered. Eliza wrote to the federal government because a land claim required it. She appeared in school history because she taught. She appeared in property research because she owned and rented houses. She entered political notices because her home hosted meetings. Laura Ann's most important labour happened inside marriage and motherhood, where the paper trail was thinner. Her adult identity was often recorded through Harrison Howard, through children, through church rites, and through later family connections. The eldest sister therefore becomes visible by looking sideways. Her daughter Angeline spent time with James and Angeline Wilder in Spring Valley. She later married Fred Merritt in Crowley. Pearlie Wilder married Fred's sister Elsie. One daughter's marriage and one brother's marriage tied Laura Ann's line to the new Louisiana network. These connections made Crowley more than Eliza Jane's private experiment. It became a place where nieces, brothers, parents, children and in-laws could find one another again. Laura Ann's son Harrison also appears in later Southern family research. Another son, Waldo, carried a name that sounded almost like a family hope made personal. The exact child list and dates vary across derivative records, so a careful account should not pretend every line has been settled. What is settled is that Laura Ann left descendants. Her life did not end at the edge of Farmer Boy because she had never entered the book in the first place. She had been born before the literary year, lived beyond the New York farm, became a Minnesota wife and mother, moved into the family's southern circle, and died in the same difficult year that took her father and Eliza Jane's husband. Her omission from the novel can make her seem less real than Alice and Eliza. In historical terms, the opposite may be useful. Laura Ann reminds us how many people stand outside famous books because the narrative has chosen someone else's age, memory, and point of view. She was the sister who had already grown. Alice was the sister whose childhood presence remained vivid because she was close enough to Almanzo's age to fit the book's family world. Eliza Jane was the sister whose strong personality crossed into two different literary portraits. By the time those portraits reached readers, none of the three women was alive. That fact places the responsibility on us. We cannot interview them. We can only compare the stories with the records and refuse the temptation to make the records say more than they do. For Alice, the temptation is grief and concealment. Because her adult life is thin, a title like Laura Never Told the Rest offers an easy villain. It suggests that the story existed in full and someone chose to bury it. The evidence supports something quieter. Farmer Boy ends because its childhood frame ends. Laura Ingalls Wilder was writing Almanzo's Boyhood, not a collective biography of every sibling until death. The book's silence after childhood is a boundary, not a confession. For Laura Ann, the temptation is to explain her omission with one neat reason. Perhaps the name would have confused readers. Perhaps she was already away. Both ideas have circulated. Neither should be treated as a private statement from the author without direct evidence. The more honest explanation is structural. Laura Ann was much older than Almanzo. A childhood story centred on a younger boy had little narrative use for a grown sister living an adult life elsewhere. For Eliza Jane, the temptation is personality. Readers who dislike the fictional teacher may search the records for proof that the real woman was always unpleasant. Readers who admire her independence may reverse the judgment and turn every hard edge into misunderstood strength. The archive refuses both simplifications. A woman can be demanding and courageous. She can be difficult in a classroom and disciplined on a claim. She can make decisions that relatives disliked and still provide a home where a niece completed school. She can fail in marriage and succeed in survival. Human beings are not corrected versions of fictional characters. They are larger than the correction. The sisters also reveal 3 ways women's work entered history. Eliza Jane's work became public documents because it crossed institutions. Alice's work became family structure because children, migration, illness, and death changed the household. Laura Ann's work became lineage because the records most often found her through marriage and descendants. All 3 kinds of labour were real. Only one produced letters detailed enough to make a historian feel close to the woman herself. This unevenness can create a false impression that Eliza Jane had the fullest life. What she had was the fullest recoverable paper trail. Alice's household may have contained years of decisions we will never know. Laura Ann may have shaped children and family movements in ways no clerk thought to record. Eliza Jane's surviving words do not make her more alive. They make her easier to hear. And hearing one sister more clearly should teach us to be gentler with the silence around the others. The children carried the sisters forward after the sisters themselves were gone. Myrtle Baldwin had been born while Alice and Albert were still connected to Minnesota. She crossed the country as a child, from a northern farm region to Merritt Island. At 12, she lost her mother. By 1900, later census-based accounts place her as a young woman in the household Albert had made with Ellen. That household deserves to remain ordinary until the records make it otherwise. Ellen should not be turned into a cruel replacement or a saintly rescuer. Myrtle and Leland should not be forced into the roles of abandoned orphans when their father remained alive. Nina, the younger child associated with Albert and Ellen, should not become a symbol of displacement. The census gives a roof and a set of names. It does not give a family's emotional arrangement. Myrtle later married John Henry Brown. Family records connect her with a large number of children, and a life that continued in Florida until 1945. The exact domestic story remains beyond the evidence used here, but the scale of the family matters. Alice's line did not end in the cemetery where Alice was buried. A girl who lost her mother in a tiny island settlement became the mother of another broad family network. Through Myrtle's children, Alice entered the 20th century in names, households, marriages, work, and memory. Leland's trail is more uncertain. Later accounts place him in the American West, including Arizona, but the endpoint repeated in family trees was not confirmed by an open civil record. It is tempting to complete the pair neatly. Myrtle remained. Leland wandered. One line grew clear, the other faded. The documents do not yet permit that shape. The honest version is that Leland becomes harder to follow. His uncertainty is not a narrative flaw. It is one of the truths of family history. Some people leave abundant descendants and records. Others appear in one census, then slip behind name variations, travel, incomplete indexes, and records that remain unopened. Albert's drowning in 1905 widened that uncertainty. Later accounts place the death in the Banana River. A river death can become cinematic almost without effort. Dark water, overturned boat, sudden weather, men calling from shore. None of that is established. The surviving statement is stark enough. Albert drowned. After that, Myrtle and Leland no longer had either parent. They were adults or near adulthood by then. Their condition was different from the one created by Alice's death. Time had moved them forward. Myrtle was building her own life. Leland was approaching the years when a young man might move, work, marry, or disappear into a new state's records. Alice's family, therefore, did not freeze in 1892. It changed again in 1905, then again through Myrtle's marriage and children, then again as memory attached itself more strongly to the mother and farmer boy than to the descendants who had actually known her. Laura Ann's children carried another line through Minnesota and Louisiana. Her daughter Angeline is especially important because she appears in the family's southern web. She spent part of her youth near the Wilder grandparents in Spring Valley. Later, in Crowley, she married Fred Merritt. Pearlie Wilder married Fred's sister Elsie. These marriages tied siblings, nieces, and in-laws into a network that could support migration. A relative already in Louisiana could offer information about land, work, weather, housing, church, schools, or business. Family did not remove risk. It made risk easier to imagine surviving. Laura Ann's other children appear unevenly in the record. Some remained connected to the Minnesota and Louisiana branches. One son's later path reached Canada in family accounts. Another child's name appears with variations that make certainty difficult. Rather than forcing every descendant into a miniature biography, it is better to see the larger condition change. Laura Ann's household became part of the bridge by which the Wilder family moved south. She had once been the daughter already living in Minnesota before the family gathered there. Near the end of her life, she again stood inside a family migration, this time toward Crowley. There is a pattern in that. Laura Ann did not leave the most dramatic individual record. She appears where households connect. Eliza Jane's son Wilder carried a different inheritance. His mother's name for him kept her birth family close, but his childhood unfolded inside the aftermath of Thomas Thayer's death and Eliza's efforts to remain economically independent. When Rose came to Crowley, Wilder was still a boy. The two young people shared a household shaped by Eliza Jane's practical decisions. Rose was older and hungry for a larger world. Wilder was growing inside the consequences of his mother's late marriage and widowhood. Rose's year in Louisiana is often told as part of Rose Wilder Lane's story, and rightly so. She completed school there. She encountered a town more socially and politically varied than Mansfield. She lived near an aunt who had refused the most conventional order of female adulthood. But the arrangement also belongs to Eliza Jane's story. She had room, authority, and enough connection to make the invitation possible. A widow renting rooms helped give her niece access to education beyond what the Missouri household could provide. The decision did not require Eliza Jane to be soft or easy. A person can be demanding and still open a door that changes another person's life. Rose graduated in 1904. She soon moved beyond both Crowley and Mansfield into work, travel, marriage, writing, and political argument. The aunt's influence should not be exaggerated into a straight line, but it belongs in the network of examples Rose had before her. Her mother, Laura Ingalls Wilder, represented one form of endurance. Her aunt Eliza Jane represented another. Laura built a farm household with Almanzo through poverty and long labour. Eliza built claims, classrooms, office work, property, rentals, and repeated economic reinvention. Rose would spend much of her life moving between both inheritances, valuing independence while remaining entangled with family. The sisters' children also changed what could be remembered. Alice's descendants preserved family knowledge about Georgiana, Albert, Myrtle, and Leland. Laura Ann's descendants preserved names and movements largely absent from the Little House books. Eliza Jane's son and niece connected her to later stories, photographs, property research, and memories of Crowley. Family history is often assembled backward in this way. A grandchild remembers an address. A descendant keeps a photograph. A newspaper notice confirms a meeting. A cemetery transcription supplies a date. A federal file preserves a letter because someone once questioned a land claim. No single document carries the whole person. The adult sisters emerge through overlap. For Alice, the county marriage index confirms the couple. Later census chains confirm the children. Maps explain Georgiana. Cemetery records anchor the final place. A newspaper notice places her mother and brother in Florida during the same winter. For Laura Ann, church history confirms marriage rights. Local histories place her in Spring Valley. Children and southern marriages carry her into Louisiana. Later family records attach her death to the terrible year of 1899. For Eliza Jane, the evidence is denser. School history, homestead letters, federal records, newspapers, property maps, marriage records, political notices, and the biography of Rose all intersect. The imbalance is so large that Eliza Jane could easily take over the documentary. That would be another kind of distortion. Alice remains the emotional anchor because her early death gives the question urgency. Laura Ann remains essential because her omission from the novel reveals the boundary of literary memory. Eliza Jane remains the strongest documented adult arc because her papers show a woman repeatedly negotiating institutions that usually flatten women into names beside men. Together, the three sisters make the story complete enough for long form without pretending that every life left equal evidence. They also change the meaning of the word after. After Farmer Boy does not mean one hidden sequel. For Laura Ann, after means a life already underway before the book's chosen childhood frame. For Eliza Jane, after means teaching, land, government work, marriage, widowhood, property, politics, and long survival. For Alice, after means marriage, children, Minnesota, Florida, illness and death at 38. The book stops. The sisters do not stop together. To understand how different those adult paths were, it helps to notice what each woman could place under her own name. Eliza Jane's homestead claim is the clearest example. The federal government recognized her as the claimant. The house improvements, cultivation, residence, and proof were attached to Eliza Wilder. When officials raised questions, she answered for herself. That legal visibility was unusual enough to feel modern and ordinary enough to be part of the Homestead Act's design. Unmarried women who met the requirements could claim land. The law opened a door, but the land beyond it demanded the same labour, money, weather endurance, and proof expected from men. The difference was that a single woman's failure might be read as evidence that the whole idea had been unrealistic. A man who failed at a claim could be one unsuccessful farmer. A woman who failed could become a warning about women who reach beyond their proper place. Eliza Jane's letters push against that judgment. She did not ask officials to admire her. She described the work and conditions because the legal record needed to recognise them. Alice entered marriage before her adult property trail became clear. The Minnesota farm is attached in later accounts to Alice and Albert as a household, but without the opened deeds we should not assign ownership casually. The difference between living on land, working land, and holding legal title is not decorative detail. A married woman could labour every day on a farm and still appear in records mainly through her husband's name. Her work made the property function. The deed might make the property his. Laura Ann's adult life is even more household-centred in the surviving sources. Church rights, husband, children, and later descendants carry her forward. The legal paper does not tell us how much labour she performed, because the household itself was expected to absorb it. This is why biography can accidentally reward the person who dealt with government. Eliza Jane's conflict with officials produced letters. Alice's ordinary motherhood produced almost none. Laura Ann's decades of household work entered other people's records. The sisters' lives ask us to separate visibility from value. Teaching also looked different from the outside than it felt from within. For Eliza Jane, certification and school terms created income and movement. A classroom gave her authority, but the authority was temporary. It lasted only as long as a board, parents and students allowed it to last. The remembered de Smet school term shows how fragile that authority could be. Students who disliked a teacher could make the work almost impossible. A teacher who responded badly could deepen the hostility. A community could later remember the conflict through the students rather than the woman at the front of the room. Eliza Jane's own account of being asked to teach suggests that community members also sought her services. That does not erase the difficult term preserved in Laura's memory. It tells us that she was not simply an incompetent intruder who wandered into the schoolhouse. She had experience. She had supporters. She also had limits. By the time she accepted the de Smet position, she was already strained by claim work and health. A person balancing land and teaching might enter the classroom carrying fatigue no student could see. Again, explanation is not excuse. The point is not to declare one memory wrong. The point is to restore the conditions around it. Alice's work was less likely to be called a profession, but a farm household with 2 children required coordination as exacting as a school term. Food, clothing, cleaning, water, fuel, childcare, illness, animals, garden produce, dairy work, preservation, and seasonal labour formed an economy inside the home. When the Baldwins moved to Florida, that economy had to be rebuilt in a different climate. Northern habits met subtropical conditions. Foods changed, insects changed, clothing needs changed, transport changed. The household had to learn where supplies came from and how far a neighbour lived. None of those adjustments carries Alice's signature. They remain the likely structure of any family move, not permission to describe her personal routines as known fact. Still, the practical weight belongs in the story. The move south was not only Albert's search for health, Alice and the children had to inhabit the cure. That sentence is one of the quiet truths in migration history. A decision may be made around one person's need, but every member of the household must live inside it. If Albert's health was the reason, Alice paid part of the price in distance from her own family network. The claim should remain attributed because the contemporary medical explanation has not been opened. The consequence is visible regardless. Georgiana was far from Spring Valley. Laura Ann's later move south carried a different set of conditions. She was older. Her children were older. The Louisiana migration placed her near Eliza Jane, Prairie, parents, nieces, and in-laws. It may have promised family reunion as much as agricultural opportunity. By then, Harrison Howard was no longer part of the household in later family accounts. Laura Ann came south as a woman whose marriage had already passed into widowhood, though the exact timeline deserves caution. The destination offered kin. That is one reason families often cluster after years of scattering. A place becomes attractive because someone trusted is already there. Eliza Jane had become that person in Crowley. She knew the streets, property market, businesses and opportunities. She had a husband established there. Her invitation could make Louisiana seem less like a leap into the unknown. The result was still hard. James's death, Thomas's death, and Laura Ann's death came too quickly for the southern gathering to become the stable family centre anyone may have hoped for. The year 1899 becomes the family's second great closing after Alice's death. Alice's death had broken one household in Florida. 1899 broke the reunion in Louisiana. The old father died. Eliza Jane became a widow. Laura Ann died. Angeline Wilder survived them, an elderly mother who had now buried 2 daughters and her husband. We know those deaths occurred. We do not know how Angeline spoke about them. We do not know which child sat with her, what letters arrived, or whether the family understood the Louisiana move as mistake, misfortune, or simply life refusing to cooperate. The silence should not be filled with speeches. The sequence itself is enough. Families often remember years by accumulation. One death belongs to one person. 3 deaths close together belong to the calendar. A month or season becomes a phrase people use for decades. For the Wilders, 1899 carried that kind of weight. Eliza Jane's response was practical, because practical action was what the record could preserve. Property changed hands. She bought lots. She rented rooms. She raised Wilder. She remained in Crowley. Laura Ann's children continued. Pearlie continued. Angeline continued. The family did not leave Louisiana simply because the promise had turned painful. That decision matters. A failed dream does not always send people home. Sometimes the old home is gone, the money has been spent, children have married, land has been bought, and the new place has become the only place from which life can continue. The New York farm was no longer available. Spring Valley remained part of the family, but not the center for everyone. Dakota had become Almanzo's past. Florida held Alice's grave. Louisiana held new graves and living descendants. The Wilder family had stopped being one household long before. By 1900, it had become a map. On that map, the sisters marked 3 forms of adulthood. Laura Ann marked belonging through family connection. Eliza Jane marked self-support through institutions and repeated reinvention. Alice marked the vulnerability of a household built around health, migration, and children. None of those lives followed the simple upward line that a children's story often gives to a completed year. Work did not always produce security. Land did not always become home. Marriage did not guarantee protection. Family reunion did not prevent loss, yet neither did hardship erase the value of what they built. Laura Ann's descendants continued. Alice's descendants continued. Eliza Jane's son and niece carried pieces of her influence forward. The adult lives were not happy endings or warnings. They were lives. A map, however, can make 3 lives look simpler than they were. Put a mark in northern New York, another in Minnesota, another in Dakota, one in Florida, and one in Louisiana, and the eye turns movement into a line. It cannot show the cost of carrying a household from one climate into another. It cannot show which possessions were sold, which were packed, which were left because there was no room, or which names became harder to recognize once marriage changed the way a woman appeared in public records. The map also hides a difference that mattered to each sister. Land did not mean the same thing in every life. For Eliza Jane, land could be claimed in her own name. It could become evidence of independence, but only after years of weather, labour, legal explanation, and federal approval. Her claim was a promise made by law and tested by daily life. For Alice, land near Marshall and later in Florida belonged to a household story that remains less certain. Later accounts place the Baldwins on a Minnesota farm and then among the groves of Merritt Island. Yet the exact deeds have not all been opened, and ownership should not be made cleaner than the record allows. The important movement is not acreage. It is the family's repeated attempt to make health, work, and home fit in one place. For Laura Ann, land appears through family settlement more than personal declaration. Her adult trail is woven into a husband, children, church, kin, and later migration. The work of sustaining those connections could be enormous, but the record often lists the household without naming the labour that held it together. 3 daughters from one prosperous farm entered 3 different relationships with property. One signed and defended a federal claim. One crossed states within a married household seeking stability. One became visible mainly where family lines joined the public record. This is why the adult story cannot be told as 3 examples of the same lesson. Eliza Jane did not simply become the independent one. Alice did not simply become the tragic one. Laura Ann did not simply become the forgotten one. Those labels are too small. Eliza's independence was never complete freedom from family need. Alice's death does not erase the years in which she married, moved, raised children, received relatives, and built households in more than one place. Laura Ann's quieter trail is not proof of a quieter character. It is partly proof that a woman could work for decades inside forms of life that produced few personal documents. The surviving papers favour certain kinds of action. Government likes applications, proofs, legal descriptions, signatures, taxes, and disputes. Newspapers like accidents, visitors, marriages, deaths, public meetings, and unusual events. Churches keep baptisms, marriages, memberships, and burials. Schools keep terms, teachers, pupils, and examinations when the records survive. Families keep letters unevenly, sometimes treasuring a box for generations and sometimes losing it in a move, a fire, a damp attic, or an estate clean-out. A woman who interacted with all those institutions may seem more fully alive in the archive than a woman who spent the same years feeding children, keeping clothes in repair, receiving kin, and holding a household together. Eliza Jane left institutional tracks almost everywhere she went. She trained as a teacher. She filed for federal land. She defended the claim in letters. She worked in a government office. She bought and sold property. She appeared in newspapers, census schedules, local political life, household records, and the memories of a niece who later became famous. The abundance creates its own danger. When many records survive, a writer can confuse paperwork with personality. A deed proves a transaction. It does not prove why a woman wanted the property. A political meeting at an address proves that people gathered there. It does not tell us which sentence Eliza spoke, what she believed about every issue, or how her neighbours judged her afterward. The documents make her active. They do not make her transparent. Her homestead letters come closest to letting us hear her directly. Even there, she was writing for a purpose. She needed officials to accept that her absence from the claim had not been abandonment. Every detail was selected inside an argument. The cold mattered because it explained the hardship. The money spent on improvements mattered because it proved commitment. The belongings left behind mattered because they showed she expected to return. The blocked trains mattered because they made the length of the absence something weather had imposed rather than something she had casually chosen. A letter written to protect land is not a diary. It is still a human voice under pressure. Eliza told the commissioner that her home had been growing in beauty and desirability. That phrase is easy to pass over because the rest of the letter is filled with work, heat, cold, money and proof. But it changes the claim house from a legal requirement into something she had been shaping. Beauty did not mean luxury. It might mean a better wall, a repaired opening, a surface made clean, a small improvement that turned shelter into a place a person could bear returning to after wind and labour. Desirability meant the claim was not merely a square on a federal map. She wanted officials to understand that she had invested in living there. Then came the remembered birthday, work outdoors, cutting sleet, and cold severe enough to remain one of the details she chose years later. She did not offer that day as a dramatic performance. She offered it as proof of endurance. The letter contains one of the rare emotional words preserved in the sisters' adult record. She had felt blue and discouraged. It would be easy to build too much around that admission. We should not imagine her standing alone at a window, calculating the meaning of her life. We do not know the room, the hour, or what she did when the work ended. What we know is better because it is hers. A woman proud of what she could endure admitted that the work had reached her. She had not been made of prairie weather. She had simply continued inside it. The federal case also reveals how independence could create a second burden. Eliza had to do the work, and then she had to explain the work to men who were not there. An official reading from a desk might see a gap in residence. Eliza saw a winter that stopped trains and emptied stores. The law converted experience into dates. She had to convert the dates back into experience. That is one reason the Homestead file matters beyond the Wilder family. It shows how government records can preserve a struggle the law itself helped create. The same system that offered a woman land demanded proof in forms that could fail to understand how weather, wages, teaching, illness, and family obligation shaped residence. Eliza won the argument. The claim became hers. Yet ownership did not freeze her life around a Smet. She moved again. She worked again. She entered government service, a world very different from the one-room school or claim house. Office work gave her another institutional identity, another place where education and determination could earn wages. The move also carried her closer to public systems and farther from the image of the difficult schoolteacher. A woman could be remembered poorly by one room and valued by another. That does not mean every later job was a triumph. Records give us positions more readily than satisfaction. They show that she kept finding ways to support herself. They do not show that each beginning felt hopeful. By the early 1890s, Eliza Jane was in her 40s. She'd already lived the part of life in which many women of her generation married, raised children, and saw the oldest begin leaving home. Her path had run through classrooms, land, weather, and government work instead. Then marriage entered it. In September of 1893, Eliza Jane married Thomas Jefferson Thayer. She was 43. He had already lived an adult life before her, and the marriage brought her into another established network of relatives, property, and obligations. Their son was born the following June. He was named Wolcott Wilder Thayer and called Wilder. The name placed her birth family inside the next generation. A surname became a child's everyday name. In a family already full of repeated Lauras, Jameses, and Wilders, names were one of the ways memory moved forward. Motherhood changed Eliza's condition late in life. The woman who had taught other people's children, argued with officials and defended a claim now had an infant whose needs ignored property schedules and public reputation. We do not need to imagine what she whispered over the cradle. We can stay with the documented change. She was no longer responsible only for herself. Every later decision carried Wilder with it. The Thayers settled in Crowley, Louisiana, a town young enough that much of its identity was still being built. Crowley had been founded only a few years earlier. Rail lines, land promotion, and expanding rice culture drew settlers into southwest Louisiana, including people from northern grain states who believed their agricultural experience could be adapted to the Gulf Coast. The landscape did not resemble northern New York or Dakota. Water management shaped rice farming. Heat and humidity changed the workday. Land that looked flat and generous still required drainage, pumping, levees, timing, and knowledge that migrants did not automatically possess. Crowley grew because agriculture, railroads, merchants, builders, and speculators all expected the region to become more valuable. A family arriving there entered not a finished town but a place rehearsing its future. Thomas Thayer owned property. A large house was built for the marriage, and later local researchers followed the lots closely enough to identify the block, even when the house itself no longer stands. That level of detail can tempt us to treat architecture as happiness. A large house proves resources and intention. It does not prove what happened between the people inside. For Eliza, the house represented another kind of claim. Not a federal homestead defended against questions of residence, but a married household in a growing town. She had a husband, a child, property, and family connections beginning to gather nearby. Then she helped persuade her parents, her brother Prairie, and her sister Laura Ann to come south. The decision makes practical sense. James and Angeline were aging. Prairie had agricultural ambitions. Laura Ann's household had changed. Eliza had already established herself in Crowley and could provide information, introductions, and a known address. Family migration often begins with one person becoming a point on the map. Letters travel back with descriptions of land, weather, prices, work, and possibility. The person already there turns an unfamiliar place into somewhere a relative might imagine living. Eliza Jane became that point. The gathering could have looked like repair. After years of distance, parents, siblings, children, and grandchildren might again live near enough for ordinary visits. No train journey between Minnesota and Louisiana would be required just to sit at one another's tables. We cannot say they believed the reunion would heal every separation. We can say the move concentrated people who had spent years apart. Then, in 1899, the concentration turned loss into a sequence. James Wilder died on the first day of February. 8 days later, Thomas Thayer died. Laura Ann died later that year. 3 deaths in one family and one place do not need to be sharpened with invented words. The calendar is sharp enough. For Eliza, the year changed nearly every role around her. She was a daughter whose father had died. She was a wife who became a widow. She was a sister who lost Laura Ann. She was the mother of a small boy, and the household that had seemed established had to be rebuilt around what remained. For Angeline, the move south ended with a husband and another daughter, buried before the year had closed. Alice had died 7 years earlier in Florida. Now Laura Ann was gone too. The family had migrated toward warmth more than once. Florida had been associated with Albert Baldwin's health. Louisiana had been promoted through agricultural opportunity and kin. Warm climates were sold to northern families as answers to illness, cold, land limits, and aging. The South did not promise safety. It promised different conditions. After Thomas died, property was sold. Eliza purchased lots and moved with her son into a house where she rented furnished rooms. The detail matters because it shows how she turned space into income. A widow with property could not live on symbolism. Rooms had to be cleaned, furnished, advertised, maintained, and collected for. Strangers or boarders entered the domestic space, because domestic space had become part of the household economy. This was not the first time Eliza had converted a building into survival. The Claim House had helped her secure land. The Crowley House helped her support herself and Wilder. The forms were different, but the pattern was familiar. A structure became useful because she made it useful. Crowley also placed Eliza at the edge of another famous life. In 1903, Rose Wilder Lane came to live with her aunt and attend high school. Rose was Laura Ingalls Wilder and Almanzo Wilder's daughter. She was 16 when the arrangement began, restless enough to want more than the rural school available near her parents' Missouri farm. Eliza offered a town, a school, a household, and a route forward. The decision tells us something documented about trust. Laura and Almanzo were willing to send their only living child to Eliza Jane's home. Whatever tensions had existed in Smet, whatever sharpness later books preserved, the adult family relationship was not reduced to a schoolroom grudge. That does not prove perfect affection. It proves a practical relationship strong enough to carry responsibility for Rose. Rose lived in Crowley through her graduation. She encountered a household shaped by Eliza's property, work, widowhood, and public interests. A local notice from 1903 records a socialist meeting at the East First Street address associated with Eliza's home. One meeting does not give us a complete political creed. It does show that the house could serve as more than a boarding place. People gathered there to discuss public ideas. For Rose, who would later become a journalist, author, traveller, and political thinker, the year in Crowley belonged to a formative passage between childhood and independence. We should not claim Eliza created Rose's later beliefs. We can say Rose saw an aunt who had claimed land, earned wages, managed property, raised a son, hosted meetings, and survived repeated changes in status. A teenager notices what adults make possible, even when she later interprets it in her own way. Eliza Jane married again in 1904. Her second husband was Maxwell Gordon. The marriage did not last as a stable partnership. This part of the record requires restraint. A failed marriage invites blame. It invites a writer to turn temperament into diagnosis, or to make every earlier conflict seem like preparation for this one. The documents establish the marriage and its breakdown more securely than they establish the private reasons. Eliza's later life returned to forms of self-support. She sold goods from door to door, managed what property and income she could, and eventually moved to Lafayette. The image of door-to-door work is far from the prosperous New York farmhouse. It is also far from the federal claim or government office. A woman who had once explained $100 in house improvements to land officials now carried products to other people's doors. The change should not be treated as humiliation for dramatic effect. Work changes with age, opportunity, health, family, and necessity. What remains consistent is her refusal to disappear from the practical business of supporting life. She lived into the era of automobiles, telephones, women voting in national elections, commercial radio, and the first years of the Great Depression. The world around the girl from Franklin County changed so much that the distance cannot be measured only in miles. Eliza Jane died in 1930 at the age of 80. By then, Rose Wilder Lane had already become a professional writer. Laura Ingalls Wilder was beginning the work that would become the Little House books. The literary Eliza Jane had not yet fully entered public memory, but the family's stories were moving toward publication. She did not live to see Farmer Boy appear in 1933. That fact creates a quiet boundary. Eliza Jane could not read the finished childhood portrait in which she appeared beside Alice and Almanzo. She could not respond to the later schoolteacher portrayal that would make many readers dislike her. Whatever she might have corrected, defended, laughed at, or rejected is unavailable. The silence is chronological, not mysterious. The books arrived after her death. Alice's silence has a different shape. She died 4 decades before Farmer Boy was published. The adult Alice could not see the childhood Alice become permanent in print. Her children and relatives could recognize pieces of the household, but Alice herself could not compare the book with memory. When later readers ask what happened after Farmer Boy, they're asking a question the book was never designed to answer. The novel holds the farmhouse year open. The records carry the people out of it. Alice's adult movement began in Minnesota, inside a household that would eventually travel farther south than anyone reading the New York chapters might expect. After her marriage to Albert Baldwin, the couple lived in the region near Marshall. Their daughter Myrtle was born around 1880. Their son Leland followed in the middle of the decade. The surviving evidence gives us children, place, family connection, and movement. It does not give us a daily account. Still, the household was not isolated from the Wilder network. Alice's sister Laura Ann and members of her family stayed with the Baldwins for a time after Thanksgiving in 1882, according to later family material. The visit is one of the rare adult moments in which 2 sisters occupy the same documented household again. No conversation survives. The fact of the stay is enough to alter the image of the sisters scattering without contact. Distance existed, but so did visits, lodging, and practical family movement. A household that received a sister and children had to make space. Beds, meals, fuel, washing, childcare, and transport all expanded. We cannot assign each task to Alice. We can recognize that hospitality was work before it was sentiment. By the middle of the decade, the Baldwins' Minnesota period was ending. Later accounts connect the move south to Albert's poor health. The diagnosis is not preserved in any medical record currently available. This boundary matters because warm climate migration was common enough to create familiar language. A person was weak in the lungs. A doctor recommended warmth. A family went south. Later retellings could compress uncertain illness into a confident diagnosis. We should not do that here. The safe fact is that family history associates Albert's health with the move. The visible consequence is that Alice and 2 children left Minnesota for Florida. Health migration is often narrated around the patient, but a household does not move as an accessory to one body. Every person changes climate, food, work, neighbours, distance, and expectation. Alice had grown up in northern New York. She had lived in Minnesota. Both places taught the year through frost, planting, harvest, and long winter preparation. Merritt Island taught a different calendar. Georgiana was a small settlement shaped by water and subtropical agriculture. Citrus and pineapples belonged to the local economy. Rivers and the Long Island geography affected transport. Families could live close enough to share community and still be separated by distances that made every visit deliberate. Later, family and local histories say Albert worked in orange groves. It is safer to say he worked among the grove economy than to give him an orchard the deeds have not established. That difference may sound small. It protects the story from turning labour into ownership. A grove worker and a grove owner could stand among the same trees while living very different financial lives. One had land, capital, crop risk, and potential profit. The other had wages, or an arrangement dependent on someone else's property. For Alice, the distinction affected household security. We do not know the exact terms under which Albert worked. We know the family established itself at Georgiana and remained there through Alice's death. The move was supposed to improve conditions for Albert. Later accounts say Alice became ill instead. They use the word consumption. In the 19th century, consumption was commonly associated with wasting illness, and often with what modern readers understand as tuberculosis. But the later word is not a laboratory report. It should remain the language of the accounts that preserve it. We do not know when Alice first became sick. We do not know how quickly the illness progressed. We do not know what treatment was attempted, whether a physician attended regularly, or how much care Myrtle and Leland witnessed. The record gives us the end more clearly than the course. Alice died at Georgiana on February 22, 1892. She was 38. Myrtle was about 12. Leland was younger. The title holds on Alice's age because 38 changes the scale of the childhood memory. The girl moving through the Wilder farmhouse had been given only a little more than 3 decades beyond it. Her daughter had reached the edge of adolescence when the household lost its mother. That is enough to feel without inventing the room. Later, local reporting placed Angeline Wilder and Prairie in Florida around the period of Alice's death. Their presence matters. It tells us Alice's final Florida years were not necessarily lived beyond all family contact. It does not prove who stood at the bedside. The temptation to move a mother into a daughter's final room is understandable. It would create a clean image of return. The evidence does not allow it. We can say Angeline and Prairie were in Florida near that time. We can say the news of Alice's illness and death moved through a family already spread across several states. We can say nothing about final words. Alice was buried in the burial ground associated with Georgiana, now commonly indexed as Crooked Mile Cemetery. The names overlap because communities and burial places can outlive one another under changing labels. A grave does something a novel cannot. It fixes the adult name in the adult place. Alice Maria Wilder became Alice Baldwin. The cemetery preserves the name connected to the household she built after leaving the childhood farm. Readers may arrive through Almanzo, but the marker belongs to Alice's own adult life. After her death, the record reorganizes around the living. Albert remained with the children. By 1900, the census placed him in a household with his second wife, Ellen, Myrtle, Leland, and a younger daughter named Nina. The census gives ages and relationships more readily than emotional arrangements. It does not tell us whether Myrtle took on additional household work after her mother died. It does not tell us how Leland understood Ellen, or whether Alice's memory was spoken daily, occasionally, or almost never. It tells us that the children remained in their father's household. Albert's later death came by drowning in the Banana River in 1905, according to local and family research. The exact circumstances remain thin. There is no safe boat scene, storm, witness, or rescue to narrate. Drowning is the surviving outline. By then, Myrtle was an adult. She married John Henry Brown and became the mother of a large Florida family. Her life carried Alice's line deep into the 20th century. This continuation matters because early death can make a biography close too tightly around the grave. Alice's life did not continue, but its relationships did. Her daughter built another household. Grandchildren arrived. The girl from the New York farm became an ancestor to people whose lives belonged to Florida. Leland's later trail is less secure. Conflicting claims have not yielded a dependable endpoint. That unevenness should remain visible. One child becomes traceable through marriage, descendants, and death records. Another becomes difficult to follow. The archive does not distribute clarity according to emotional importance. The uncertainty also prevents an artificial symmetry. We cannot close both children's stories with equal confidence simply because an ending sounds better when everyone is accounted for. Laura Ann's adult life creates almost the opposite problem. She lived long enough to build a household and raise children, but the surviving record offers fewer dramatic institutional conflicts than Eliza's and less concentrated tragedy than Alice's. That can make her disappear between her sisters. She should not. Laura Ann was the oldest Wilder daughter. By the time Almanzo's remembered boyhood begins, she was already moving beyond the role a children's novel needed from a sister. Her absence from Farmer Boy is therefore one of the most important facts about the book's frame. A real child can have an older sister whose adult departure shapes the household, even when a story leaves her out. Her empty place at the table, her marriage, her visits, and the arrival of nieces and nephews all change family life. The novel does not need to explain every one of those changes to remain honest within its chosen focus. Laura Ann's adult visibility comes through the Howard family. She married Harrison Howard. Children followed. Later genealogical and church materials associate the household with names including Angeline, Harrison, Josephine, and Waldo, though exact details across compiled sources require care. The names matter because they turn one omitted sister into a network of descendants. A woman can disappear from a famous book and remain central to the people whose meals, clothes, illnesses, schooling, marriages, and memories pass through her household. The archive is least fair to ordinary competence. A spectacular failure produces a report. A land dispute produces a file. A storm produces a newspaper column. Decades in which children are fed, work is finished, relatives are received, and nothing collapses may leave only census lines. Laura Ann's thinner trail may contain that kind of success. We should not romanticize it. Marriage and motherhood did not guarantee safety or contentment. The record does not give us permission to call the household peaceful. It gives us continuity, children, movement, kinship, and eventual loss. Her presence in Spring Valley helped make Minnesota a family place before the final Wilder move. Later, her household connected again with Alice near Marshall. Still later, she joined the southern movement toward Louisiana. The repeated role is connection. Laura Ann linked places and people. She was part of the family's Minnesota beginning. She entered Alice's adult household as a visitor. She moved toward Eliza Jane's Louisiana base when the family tried to gather again. Connection is not passive. It requires travel, letters, news, arrangements, rooms, and the willingness to move towards someone else's life. By 1898, Laura Ann was no longer the young woman who had moved ahead of the family into Minnesota. She was in her 50s. The journey to Louisiana belonged to a later stage of life, when relocation carries different stakes. An older adult leaves established neighbours, familiar roads, church relationships, climate habits, and the geography of children's memories. The destination may offer kin, land, work, or relief. It also demands another beginning from a body with fewer effortless beginnings left. The record connects the move to Eliza Jane's encouragement and the larger Wilder relocation. We should not assign Laura Ann a private reason beyond that. She went south. James and Angeline went south. Pearlie went south. Family became the practical promise of the place. Then Laura Ann died in 1899. Sources conflict on the exact date. The year is secure enough for the story. The closeness to James's and Thomas Thayer's deaths gives the family gathering its tragic shape. Laura Ann's death did not produce a famous grave story or a federal file. It closed a life already missing from the best-known portrait of the Wilder children. The omission could invite the word erased. Erased is wrong. Erasure suggests an action performed against a person. Laura Ann stood outside the novel's working frame. Her adult record survived unevenly through the ordinary institutions of family life. The correct response is not accusation. It is recovery. Recovery begins by saying her name clearly enough that she is not confused with Laura Ingalls Wilder. It continues by following her into Minnesota, marriage, children, visits, and Louisiana. It ends by admitting where the sources become thin. That is less dramatic than claiming a secret. It is more respectful. The three sisters now stand at different depths in the record. Eliza Jane speaks in a federal letter and acts across land, work, property, marriage, widowhood, motherhood, politics, and care for Rose. Alice appears through a childhood portrait, education claim, marriage index, household movement, children, Florida community, death date, cemetery and aftermath. Laura Ann appears through the space outside the novel, church and family records, children, household connections, migration and death. Together they reveal something larger than three biographies. They reveal how literary memory and public records favour different stages of a woman's life. Childhood is vivid because Farmer Boy gives it scenes. Adult life is uneven because no single adult narrator followed all three sisters. The book creates continuity through storytelling. The records create fragments through institutions. A scene in a novel can preserve the way a family meal felt. A census can preserve who was present decades later. A land file can preserve the legal struggle of one claimant. A marriage index can preserve a pairing while losing the day. A cemetery can preserve an adult name while losing the household voice that once answered to it. None of those sources is enough alone. The book is not a civil record. The civil record is not a life. The most honest documentary moves between them without asking either to become what it is not. When Farmer Boy presents Alice carrying out a task, the scene tells us how Laura Ingalls Wilder shaped Almanzo's memory of his sister. It may preserve genuine family habits. It may combine events. It does not prove what Alice did on an exact Tuesday. When Eliza Jane's Homestead file preserves her words, it proves she made an argument to federal officials. It does not tell us how she spoke to a classroom every day. When Laura Ann is absent from the novel, the absence proves the book omitted her. It does not prove hostility, shame, or concealment. These boundaries do not weaken the story. They make the story trustworthy enough to carry emotion. Trust changes retention in a quiet way. A listener does not have to keep questioning whether the beautiful line is true. The beauty can come from the truth's shape. Three sisters began inside one northern household. The oldest moved into marriage and family connection before the remembered boyhood had fully closed. The second turned education into wages, land into a legal fight, property into income, and repeated loss into repeated work. The third remained vivid beside Almanzo in childhood, then crossed into an adult record so thin that a county index and a Florida grave became essential parts of following her. Their paths were not parallel, but they crossed at important moments. New York held the common beginning. Spring Valley held the family's Minnesota regrouping. The region near Marshall placed Alice, Laura Ann, Almanzo, and Angeline within a wider network of farms and visits. De Smet placed Eliza Jane and Almanzo near the Ingalls family, where one sister became a teacher in Laura's memory, and one brother became Laura's husband. Florida drew Alice's household south and later drew Angeline and Pearlie near the end of Alice's life. Crowley drew Eliza Jane, then James, Angeline, Pearlie, and Laura Ann into one final attempt at family nearness. The family never fully returned to one table. Perhaps no adult family does. Children grow into surnames, jobs, properties, spouses, and places that cannot all be brought together. The original household survives as memory long after it has stopped being a practical arrangement. Farmer Boy preserves the practical arrangement at its most satisfying. Everyone has a role. Work leads toward meals, celebrations, animals, harvest, and a boy's growing confidence. The year closes with the family intact. The adult record refuses that closure. A farm is sold. Sisters marry. One claims land alone. One follows a husband's health south. One moves toward family late in life. Children are born. Parents age. A sister dies at 38. A father, husband, and sister die in one Louisiana year. A niece comes to live with an aunt. A widow rents rooms. A daughter raises children in Florida. A federal letter waits in an archive. A grave keeps an adult name. Those are not plot twists arranged for a novel. They are condition changes preserved unevenly across a family's long dispersal. Alice remains the emotional centre, because her death reveals the distance most sharply. The child in the book feels present. The adult woman becomes difficult to follow. At 38, the trail ends before the century turns, but Alice's thin record should not swallow her sister's. Eliza Jane's long life shows what survival can look like when it produces too many beginnings to fit a single label. Laura Ann's quieter record shows how a woman may remain indispensable to descendants, while nearly disappearing from popular memory. The contrast is the real answer to what happened after Farmer Boy. There was no single after. There were marriages and classrooms, homesteads and household work, Minnesota winters and Florida groves, Dakota storms and Louisiana rice country. There were federal questions, church entries, census lines, newspaper notices, family visits, property sales and graves. There was also the ongoing work of turning strangers' places into family places. Eliza made a claim house desirable. Alice made households in Minnesota and Florida. Laura Ann carried family connection from one region into another. Each act involved home, but home meant something different every time. For Eliza, home could be argued into legal ownership and later converted into rooms that earned money. For Alice, home moved around the health of a husband and the needs of children, until the final Florida settlement became the place where she was buried. For Laura Ann, home appears through the people who moved with her, visited her, descended from her, and gathered near her sister. The word home can sound soft. In these lives it was built from contracts, chores, travel, care, weather, money, and loss. That is why the original New York farm continued to matter even after it was sold. It provided the family's deepest shared grammar. Work had seasons, food had sources, children had duties, adults expected usefulness. Land could reward attention but never remove risk. A household was strongest when many hands understood what needed doing. The sisters carried that grammar into different sentences. Eliza's sentence was public and argumentative. She could tell an official what she had endured and why it counted. Alice's sentence was domestic and migratory, visible through family movement and the records produced when a household changed place or lost a member. Laura Ann's sentence was connective, written across kinship rather than one dramatic institutional file. No sentence gives us the whole woman. The ending of this story therefore cannot be a verdict on which sister lived best. Eliza's longevity did not spare her widowhood, failed marriage, hard work, or the loss of close family. Alice's shorter life did not make every year tragic. Laura Ann's quieter documentation did not make her less significant. The better measure is whether we can return each of them to adult time. Laura Ann was not merely the sister left out of Farmer Boy. She became Laura Howard, a wife, mother, traveller, visitor, and part of the family's final southern gathering. Eliza Jane was not merely the sister readers remember disliking as a teacher. She became a homesteader whose own words survive, a wage earner, government worker, property holder, wife, mother, widow, landlady, political host, aunt, and repeated beginner. Alice was not merely the capable girl beside Almanzo or the woman who died young. She became Alice Baldwin, a wife and mother who moved from New York memory to Minnesota farming, and then to a small Florida settlement, where her children's lives continued after her own ended. The names after marriage matter: Howard, Thayer, Baldwin. They show how easily sisters can disappear when researchers look only under the surname of childhood. They also show that disappearance is often a search problem before it is a historical mystery. A woman moves into another household, and the archive files her elsewhere. The book keeps the childhood name, the census keeps the married name, the cemetery keeps the final name. The reader must learn to follow all three. That work changes the way the childhood scenes feel. Alice's competence in Farmer Boy no longer leads into an empty future. It leads toward adult movement, children, Florida, illness, and descendants. Eliza's sharpness no longer belongs only to family comedy or schoolroom conflict. It belongs beside a woman willing to defend her land in writing and rebuild income after widowhood. The absence of Laura Ann no longer feels like proof that she vanished. It becomes a doorway into the limits of the novel and the ordinary difficulty of recovering married women from scattered records. The book has not changed. The reader has. That may be the gentlest kind of historical correction. No beloved scene needs to be destroyed. No author needs to be accused. We simply allow the people outside the frame to stand beside the people within it. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote Farmer Boy decades after the events it evokes. The series was based on lived experience but shaped with artistic license. That is not a flaw hidden inside the books. It is how memory became literature. Literature selects. History follows what selection leaves behind. Sometimes the search finds a full file. Sometimes it finds a single index entry. Sometimes it finds a grave and a name used by two communities. Sometimes it finds no answer at all. The unanswered parts should remain part of the experience. We still do not know the exact day Alice married Albert because the accessible index and later accounts do not agree completely. We do not know Albert's diagnosis. We do not know Alice's medical cause of death from an open civil or medical record. We do not know who stood in the room when she died. We do not know the full course of Leland's later life. We do not know every reason Laura Ann chose Louisiana. We do not know the private reasons Eliza Jane's second marriage failed. We do not know what any sister would have said about the finished books. Uncertainty does not mean nothing happened. It means the event is larger than the surviving proof. The archive gives us edges. The story must not paint beyond them as though imagination were recovered evidence. Near Burke, the Wilder farm still gives the childhood world physical scale. Rooms can be measured. Barns and fields can be walked. Visitors can imagine the labour required to fill the tables remembered in the book. In South Dakota, Eliza Jane's claim can be placed within the federal grid. Her letters can be read as a woman's argument that hardship and absence did not cancel intention. In Florida, Alice's grave gives the adult journey a final address. In Louisiana, property lines, local notices, family graves, and Rose's year in Crowley keep Eliza's later household connected to a wider story. Laura Ann's path is less concentrated in one famous object. Perhaps that is fitting. Her adult significance survives most clearly through connection itself. A daughter gone ahead, a sister received in another household, a mother whose children carried the line onward, a woman who joined the family's southern movement and died before its promise had settled. Connection rarely leaves a monument. It leaves people in one another's records. As this story closes, the farmhouse returns. Not the farmhouse as proof that childhood was perfect. Not the farmhouse as a museum sealed against time. The farmhouse as the last place where these sisters can still be imagined under one family name before adult records begin separating them. Laura Ann is already near the edge of the frame. Eliza Jane is old enough to look outward toward education and work. Alice remains close enough to Almanzo to move through the remembered year beside him. They do not know the names Howard, Thayer and Baldwin will eventually carry their adult lives. They do not know Minnesota, Dakota, Florida or Louisiana as endings. They know the day's work. That is where Farmer Boy leaves them most powerfully, before the legal descriptions, before the county indexes, before the death notices, before the grave names and finding aids. History does not need to keep them there. It can let Laura Ann walk out first and follow her toward family. It can let Eliza Jane leave with books, wages, land papers, and a determination that survived being misunderstood. It can let Alice leave with the ordinary hopes of marriage and children, then follow the household south without inventing what the journey felt like inside her. And when the records separate, history can say so. The adult sisters do not return to one room at the end. Their lives remain in different places, just as their papers do. Laura Ann's descendants carry one continuation. Myrtle and her children carry Alice's continuation. Wilder Thayer and Rose's Crowley year carry part of Eliza Jane's. The literary household carries all three unevenly. That unevenness is no longer a failure once we understand it. It is the shape of survival. Some lives become stories early, some become files, some become family names on a census page, some become a marker under Florida trees, and some must be rebuilt carefully from the places where another person's record happens to mention them. Before we leave them, it is worth placing three pieces of paper beside one another. They are not equal in size, and they do not tell equal amounts. Together they show how adult women enter history. The first is Eliza Jane's Homestead correspondence. It is expansive by comparison. She explains weather, absence, money, labour, a house, and the intention behind what she had done. Her name is attached to an argument because ownership depended on officials believing her. The danger of losing land gave the archive a reason to preserve detail. The second is the marriage index that joins Alice Wilder to Albert Baldwin. It is smaller. It gives a pairing more confidently than a scene and leaves the precise year in dispute across later accounts. Yet that narrow line performs a crucial act. It carries Alice out of the surname by which readers know her and into the adult household under which later records must be searched. The third is the church and family record surrounding Laura Ann Howard. It does not speak with Eliza's first-person force or end with the finality of Alice's grave. It places Laura Ann inside rites, children, visits, and migration. Her adult life becomes visible not because she defended a claim, but because communities recorded the points where one household joined another. One sister had to persuade the federal government. One crossed an index under a married name. One appears through relationships that institutions considered worth listing. The difference is not a difference in human value. It is a difference in what caused paper to be created and kept. This matters whenever a famous family is reconstructed. The person with the longest file can begin to look like the most important person. The person with the shortest file can begin to look passive, ordinary, or unknowable. Neither conclusion is safe. Eliza's file grew because law required proof. Alice's record narrowed because household life and illness did not produce the same federal exchange. Laura Ann's record scattered because connection was her most visible archival form. The three pieces of paper also ask three different things from a narrator. Eliza's letters ask us to listen without turning advocacy into a private diary. Alice's index asks us to build chronology without decorating uncertainty. Laura Ann's family trail asks us to recognise work and influence, even when no dramatic document places her at the centre. That discipline is not separate from feeling. It is what allows feeling to remain clean. When we know Eliza herself admitted discouragement, the word belongs to her. When we know Alice's daughter was still young at her mother's death, the age carries its own cost. When we know Laura Ann moved toward her sister and died within the year of the family's losses, the sequence creates weight without a sentence placed in her mouth. The paper is incomplete, but it is not cold. It becomes cold only when people are reduced to entries. Read carefully, an entry is a door. It tells us where we may stand, what we may see, and where honesty requires us to stop. That stopping place protects the women from being borrowed for a better ending than their evidence permits. It also protects the listener from a story that sounds intimate only because intimacy was invented. The real intimacy is quieter. A woman remembers the money put into a claim house. A sister's married name survives in a county index. A mother and children remain linked across household records. A niece is sent to an aunt for school. A daughter carries a family line beyond a grave. A childhood book keeps the sound of work long after the adult workers have scattered. These details are small enough to trust. Together they are large enough to hold the story. Alice died at 38. That fact remains the sharpest edge of the title. It is not the whole answer. The whole answer is that life continued after the book in three directions. One sister's trail became long and argumentative. One became quiet and connective. One became brief, migratory, and unfinished. Together they make the childhood book larger without asking it to become a different book. The girls at the New York farm were not erased when the final page closed. They simply became women the novel was no longer following. Tonight the records followed them a little farther. They carried Laura Ann into a household of her own, and then toward the family's last southern gathering. They carried Eliza Jane through a claim house, a schoolroom, a federal office, marriage, motherhood, widowhood, rented rooms, and another generation's education. They carried Alice through marriage, Minnesota, 2 children, Florida, a grave at 38, and a daughter whose family continued beyond her. The record didn't answer every question. It answered enough to replace disappearance with distance, and distance, once mapped carefully, can still lead us home. The house is quiet now. The work is finished for tonight. The papers can be folded, the lamp lowered, and the 3 sisters left not in one ending, but in the honest reach of the lives they lived. Good night.